bad allergies, so it's sort of in and out. My name is Summer Shezyk, spelled S-H-E-W-C-Z-Y-K, and my topic is gender identity. Thank you. So this is the genderbread person, and the point of it is to explain the difference between sex, gender, expression, and attraction, because these are terms that a lot of people think they understand, but they really don't. See, sex is what you're assigned at birth, and that's based on anatomy. That's usually on a male to female spectrum. Gender is how we see the sexes and what we consider appropriate for them, and it's also how we see ourselves. Expression is sort of self-explanatory. It's how we express ourselves in regard to sex and gender. And attraction is more like sexuality. It's who you take an interest in. And trans is a word I'm going to use a lot. It's transgender, and what that means is just somebody whose gender does not identify with the sex they were assigned at birth. Cisgender is the opposite. It's somebody who does identify with what they were assigned at birth. Okay. This is the gender umbrella, and because gender isn't a male to female spectrum, there are countless terms for people who don't consider themselves male or female. And that ranges from two-spirit to third gender to non-gender. And definitions for these vary from person to person. And also, we don't have statistics available because no studies have been done that account for the entire spectrum. So there's a big step in gender at 3 years old, and that's usually when kids first realize the physical differences between men and women. And once that happens, they start to notice cultural differences, and also start to imitate their parent of the same sex. However, there are conditions that can affect the sense of gender in kids. And the one that happens in girls is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And essentially, it's a disorder of the adrenal glands, what causes adrenaline. And when the fetus is still in the womb, that starts overproducing. And usually, these children are born with the anatomy of a male and later develop the gender identity of a male. And they also can't produce corticosteroids, so they have to take hormone replacements throughout their life. They also have to be careful with illness and in stressful situations. That affects about 1 in every 14,200 baby girls. The one for boys is called androgen insensitivity syndrome. That affects about 1 in every 20,000 baby boys. And essentially what it does is it makes the body immune to its own hormones that give it the male appearance. So while they will have X and Y chromosomes, they will have the outside appearance of a female because they can't use these hormones that would give them a male appearance. This is if gender were a game board, and it's a really great metaphor for gender because a lot of people who struggle with gender can feel really caught up in these twists and turns. And the rules of the game are, play as many times as you want. When you feel comfortable in your own skin, you win. And because people might think, I identify as this, and then as time goes on, they might start to think, wow, this really doesn't suit me like I thought it did. And it's perfectly okay to change your gender. Once you choose a gender, you're not stuck with it. And a transition is the process by which somebody lives their identity, the process they go through to live their identity. And you've probably all heard the term tranny, and it's usually associated to transsexuals. Quick note, transsexual and transgender are not the same thing. Usually transsexual people have been through a transition, whereas transgender is you just don't identify with what you were assigned at birth. And the term tranny actually originated in Australia in the 1960s and 70s. And through this time, a lot of the male to female transsexuals were moving through drag, and that created a really strong bond between the transsexuals and the drag queens, and that bond was nicknamed tranny. But these days we use it to kind of encompass most of the umbrella. And while we're on the subject of names, a preferred name is also pretty self-explanatory. It's a name somebody prefers to their birth name. Now, this is a really important visual because it is your job to please your gender and nobody else's. You have no right to tell somebody that, oh, you're just going through a phase or you're going to regret this in a few years, because even personally, I know half a dozen transgender people who are perfectly happy and have been for years. And granted, it happens, some people might go through a transition and then realize, wow, I don't think I identify as this. But you can't generalize an entire umbrella with a select group of them. And while we're on that subject, a few things that are considered harassment. Purposefully calling someone by their non-preferred, for example, if you know a female to male transgender who wants to be referred to as he and you purposely call them she, not referring to someone with their preferred pronoun or their preferred name. Also, outing the person to others without their consent. And just essentially creating an environment where they don't feel safe. And for this project, I actually interviewed an androgynous friend of mine named Squash. And I asked them to explain androgynous, and they said they don't really feel like they identify as male or female, so another term for it would be gender neutral. And they started to realize they might not identify as female when they were in 8th grade, and until their gap year, they didn't really know how they identified, and then during their gap year, they realized their androgynous identity. And I asked them what advice they would give to students who are struggling with gender, and what they told me was, do a lot of research and do a lot of soul searching. Understand that gender, you don't have to know, and you've got plenty of time. There are a lot of ways to be supportive to the trans community. I'm sorry. Referring to someone by their preferred name and pronoun is a really big thing. And if you don't know how to address somebody, ask them, because they will definitely rather than that than you misgendering them. And I would know that from experience. I accidentally referred to a person by the wrong pronoun, and now it's one of my biggest fears. I'm sorry. Also, just educating yourself on trans issues and knowing there's no such thing as a universal transgender. They come from all races, classes, you name it, all ages even. So a student might walk through school and look around and see people labeling themselves male, female, gay, straight, and that can really make them feel isolated because they just have no idea. And there are actually ways that staff can make school a better environment for trans students. One of these ways is to create gender-neutral restrooms. And it doesn't sound like a big thing, but actually that's a big issue for the trans community. Because, for example, if there's a male-female transgender student, and maybe they like to dress femininely, I don't know, they need to use the restroom, right? And if they go into the women's restroom, then everybody panics because, whoa, there's a boy and a girl's bathroom, even though they do identify as female. Whereas if they go into the men's restroom, they might get teased or beat up. Also, creating gender-neutral spaces, like not splitting the class into boys on one team, girls on another team, or every girl will get with a boy partner, because that can isolate transgender students. And taking criticism is so important, because if a student comes to you and says, I don't feel safe, I don't feel comfortable, then you can adjust the classroom. And finally, not enforcing gender stereotypes and roles, because that's something we do a lot without thinking. Maybe you compliment a boy more on his athleticism and a girl on her appearance, but that can also isolate trans students. And I want to, So for this project, I took a BSRI Sexual Inventory Test, and basically what it does is it asks you a bunch of questions that are based off of gender roles, you know, like how often do you cook, how often do you clean, how often do you dress up, that sort of thing. And as you can see from my results, I am more masculine than feminine. But I was born female and I identify as female. And the point I want to make with this is that you can't judge people based on how they act. You can't assume that somebody is cisgender or transgender. Because, like I said, I identify as female, but I tend to be more masculine. And I'd like to close with a poem that I found and thought was just perfect. Women are women regardless of sex, and men are men in the same respects. You can be both, or a mix of the two, or you can be neither if that's what suits you. People are people, whatever their parts, because what really matters is what's in our hearts. Thank you.